So we talked before, and in the field of view calculator, we talked about resolution. Let's look at history a little bit. In terms of history, does everybody know the term analog cameras? It's an old camera, right? They won't be making them very much longer. That's another fact of analog, right? They weren't IP, so they weren't connected to a network. So they had a cable that goes between the camera and the head end for every camera. What else? The resolutions were much lower than today. Who has a TV at home that's not a flat panel TV? Who has a picture tube type TV?
Come on, man. Come on,
Who watches non-HD TV? So like, the channel range that's HD and the channel range that's not HD. Can everybody at least say they realize the significant difference between regular old TV and HD TV?
Yeah.
What is the difference?
Well, you're sitting in a bar trying to watch a game, and you're like, what is this? I can't even see the ball. There's a big difference between the two when you're used to the HD version.
The crispness of
Yeah.
that.
Right? Colors appear a lot better, right? You can see the names on the back of the jerseys. You can see. So what's the bad part of it? See, if you're crazy sensitive, and you're looking at like the newscaster, you're more focused on the pores on his nose or the bump on his forehead or what the guy did with the makeup on his eyebrow than you are what he's saying, because it drives me crazy. It's kind of like overload because there's so much detail, right? So when we talk about analog video, it's kind of like that old TV that Rich has got. It's that old big picture tube TV. It's about that deep, and he's probably got one about that big. And it's probably mounted in a piece of furniture that's 3 times that big because it has to hold it and balance it. And he has to have a strap on it so it doesn't fall off and hurt him. Right? So then you move to HD. Now I've got flat panel monitors. I've got a lot more detail. It's crisp. The colors are a lot better. Things are different. So when we start to change in terms of technology, we start to talk about resolution, right? The ability for the camera to recreate a more clear picture. So when we talk about resolution, the higher the number, the better. It gets to be really confusing. In the old analog world, we talked about TV lines of resolution. Steve's nodding his head. He's an old timer. He knows that. And you had these standard definition cameras that were color were like 230 line, 230 TVL. And you have black and white that was 580 TVL. The 230 was lower resolution than the 580. So the black and white cameras made a much more clear, detailed picture. The other thing was when we recorded analog, the recording devices on analog used to diminish or lower the resolution even that much more. Even though the camera might have been a high resolution color camera at like 420 TVL or 480 TVL, you were recording it onto a VCR. Everybody remember a VCR? Or VHS tapes, beta tapes, and stuff like that. The resolution on those tapes was down into the 200 to 230 type range, 230 TVL. So you had a 420 TVL camera that recorded an image that was 230 or less, 250, 280 TVL. So we were reducing all the way. As we start to change in technology, number one, we stopped using TVL, TV lines of resolution. By the way, this is a throwback. The way they used to measure TV lines of resolution, where they had this special chart that you used. You sat the camera at a certain distance, you put a lens on it that gave you just this area of this picture you were looking at, and they started with these lines that got closer together the closer they got to the center of this V. This really wasn't very scientific. The place where you couldn't read the number on the line anymore, where this became one solid line, that was the resolution of the camera. where you couldn't tell the difference between the lines, you know, you couldn't see the separation, that's how they measured TV lines of resolution. Nowadays, we don't do that. We use pixels, okay? So we start talking about differences between analog video and HD video. The key is the clarity, right? The camera's ability to reproduce a more clear picture. This is just some number stuff that's related. So we talk about pixel count. This is vertical rows of pixels on the chip and horizontal rows of pixels on a chip. Everybody heard the term megapixel? Okay, we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So SIF was old analog video. It was 320 by 240, that's round numbers, okay? 4SIF is 640 by 480. When we plug an analog camera into an encoder, which we'll talk about in a couple of seconds, so we can put it on the network and we can record it, the highest resolution we can get out of the camera because of the encoder, the digitizing piece of it, is 640 by 480. We can also tune it down so it can do 320 by 240. So SIF and 4SIF. Now, who remembers the first HD TVs? What was the resolution? They always said 720p, right? Now, 720p was 1080 pixel count wide and 720 pixel count high. Okay? Then we went to what? 1080p. That is 1920 wide and 1080 high. Much higher density pixels gives you the ability to recreate a clearer picture. Okay? Does everybody understand that? The higher the resolution, the more pixels it takes to do that. Does everybody remember when we were listening to the field of view calculator? He said, how many pixels does it take to be able to identify someone? He gave a number. Does everybody remember what that was? 55, 50? Okay. There is actually a written standard in a document that we'll cover in a little bit that if somebody really wanted to get in great detail, that document covers the number of pixels in a given space that it requires to classify, detect, recognize, or identify. It actually gives you that count. Okay? So he said a normal license plate or a face can be identified with plus or minus 55 pixels per foot. Right? So just for reference sake, this is 0.9 megapixels. This is 2.1 megapixels. So these are the first cameras that you hear that get into these megapixel ratings. Now, we're going to talk about something a little bit beyond that, and I don't know some of the numbers, so Matt's going to help me out and edit some of this out at some point. So 5 megapixels. Has anybody ever gone to the movies or gone to Best Buy and seen a TV or seen a movie where they come on the screen and say, this is recorded in Sony 5 megapixel? No. No, because 5 megapixel is not a standard. It's not an industry standard. So by that, it's very difficult for me to give you quantities of vertical and horizontal. However, if you look at bottom right corner, it says video resolution. What does it give for pixel count for 5 megapixel? Oh, also says upright mode. What does that mean? This is normal. This is upright. This is normal. This is upright. My point here is that 5 megapixel, there's a number that's given, but there's no standard. And so this is a Bosch camera. If you pull up an AD camera or a Pelco camera or somebody else's camera, those numbers may vary depending upon how their imager is arranged. So in this case, the 5 megapixel is how many pixels wide if I'm using standard, not the upright? How many is it? 3072 by what?
1728.
Okay. That's my pixel count. Vertical, vertical, horizontal. Okay, now go to the one that says IP Ultra 8000. IP Ultra 8000. Find the resolution on this one. Page 6, bottom right corner. Now, how many people, oh, I'm sorry, looks like this. It's one of those box cameras. Looks like this. What's the resolution? In 12 megapixel, which is the highest setting, it's what? What does 4K say?
3840 by 2160.
How many people have been to the movies and seen when the movie's starting it says recorded in Sony 4K or Ultra 4K? Okay, 4K is the next standard format, industry standard format after 1080p. So my point is these two formats, and you can find a camera that's a 20 megapixel or a 40 megapixel. There's some really high resolution cameras. But the quantity of pixels on the chip is a mathematical equivalent of what this works out to be, just like these are. But 4K is a standard. So your standards were CIF, 4CIF, 720p, 1080p, and now 4K. All right? So everybody's 4K camera has to meet the same requirement. Everybody's 1080p camera has to meet the same requirement. Everybody's 720p camera, 4CIF, CIF, have to meet the same requirement for that standard. Okay? 4K camera has how many times more pixels than that old analog camera? A lot. Good answer. So if I put a 4K camera out there and a 4CIF camera out there, am I going to be able to tell the difference in the picture? Okay. This is a really good video. We've done this a couple of times, okay? Organizationally, we've done this a couple of times. There's a really good video that explains some of this stuff so that you can show this to a customer who doesn't understand the difference.
What are we doing standing out by the side of the road here?
Wow.
A whole bunch of equipment set up. What's going on here?
What we're doing today is we're updating our comparison, resolution comparison.
Tom, we have a whole bunch of cameras set up behind here. Tell me a little bit about what we have. I do know that we have 4CIF and 720p.
Correct.
Because there's a lot of that technology still out there. Customers are still using it.
Absolutely. The prison market, a lot of our bigger customers are still using the 4CIF. Reason why? They have thousands of these cameras out there, and they're not just going to throw them away.
So it's still important to do a comparison there, but what else do we have here to show?
Sure. You know, we have 4CIF, we have 720, we have 1080, we have 5 megapixel, we have 4K, which is 12 megapixel, but also now we even have the panoramic camera and our 180 camera, which now completely puts us into a different realm because now we're able to get much more field of view from one camera.
If our goal was to be able to identify Ari at 170 feet, we wouldn't be using this kind of lens if that was our goal.
That is correct. So what is important to note and what you're speaking to is that resolution is very important, but field of view is as equally as important in trying to get useful information.
So the wider the field of view, the less detail you're going to get at a further distance.
Correct. Before we do our image resolution comparison, let's look at a reference image and take a look at the targets that we're going to be comparing. First is going to be a license plate at 40 feet away. Second is going to be our subject here at 50 feet away. We have a sign that is 100 and 100 feet away. And we also have another subject sitting across the street here at 170 feet away. So those are our references that we're going to be focusing on in our image resolution comparison. So let's go to our first view where we are comparing standard definition, 4CIF, 720p, 1080p, and 5 megapixel. So let's start by zooming in on the license plate with the 4CIF camera. And we're zooming in all the way so that we have the maximum zoom capability with all these comparisons for an accurate comparison. Now we'll move on to the 1080p. And lastly, the 5 megapixel. Now, let's start over again and look at our next view. This is a subject at 50 feet away. So starting with our standard def, 50 feet away. Now we'll move on to our 720p. Viewing a man at 50 feet away. Moving on to 1080p. Obviously, we can start to see the difference in the resolutions here. And lastly, this is our 5 megapixel. 50 feet away comparison. Let's move on to our signage, which is at 100 feet away. We'll start with our 4CIF again. Looking at what we have with regard to gas prices at 100 feet away. That was 720p. Let's move on to 1080p. And lastly, our 5 megapixel. And there's our comparison between 4CIF up to 5 megapixel. Now let's move on to our fourth and final target for comparison. Starting with 4CIF, let's look at our person across the street. This one is 720p, looking across the street. Moving on to 1080p. Looking at our test subject across the street. And lastly, our 5 megapixel. And this distance is 170 feet. Man-sized target across the street. Now in our second view, we are going to increase the resolution and eliminate the 4CIF camera. We're going to use a 720p. So these are all HD cameras. 720p, a 1080p compared to 5 megapixel. And lastly, we're now adding 4K into the equation. So these are the four resolutions. Let's again start with our test subject. Distance of 40 feet again, license plate. All the way zoomed in. This is 1080p. Moving on to our 5 megapixel. And lastly, 4K now. So that is the comparison with HD images. Let's move on to our next target. Again, 50 feet away, man-sized target. That was 720p, now I'm on 1080p. 50 feet away with a Starlight 5 megapixel. And lastly, our 4K, man size at 50 feet away. Continuing on to our sign again. 720p, viewing our sign, gas prices. 1080p, same image. Great comparison. 5 megapixel. And if you notice when I zoom in, these are all zoomed in on the same, they're about the same size. So I'm getting a very even comparison. So again, 100 feet away. Lastly, let's go to our last test of a man-sized target, 720p. Again, this is 170 feet. 170 feet with 1080p, 170 feet with 5 megapixel. Lastly, 4K. So our last demonstration of resolution comparison, this is a 4K at 170 feet. In our third and final view, here we are comparing Starlight 5 megapixel, Bosch 4K, with now adding in panoramic cameras. This is a panoramic 180 degree camera. We also have a panoramic 360 degree camera. And these panoramic cameras, the 180 and the 360, are 12 megapixel 4K cameras. So let's zoom in again on our test subjects, looking at the license plate. We've done this before, but let's look at how that compares to our panoramic cameras. So now I'm doing the Bosch 4K. Now the panoramic camera, which again is 12 megapixel. So this is a 180 degree 4K. This is a 360 degree, so a very wide angle, a very wide field of view. So what is very compelling to point out here, that even though we are comparing 4K in 3 of these images, these all are 4K resolutions, what we have is a difference in field of view. In our 180 degree field of view versus a 360 degree field of view, in comparison to our 4K camera with say a 20 degree field of view. So the resolution is the same on these cameras, but we're talking about a very varying degree in field of view, which obviously results in less detail. We are sacrificing detail to gain a very large, wide field of view. So now we're going to move on to our next target. Same comparison. We're going to move on to our man-sized target at 50 feet away. Five megapixel. This is 4K. This is again 4K. 4K 180 degree panoramic camera. And this is our 4K 360 degree panoramic, much wider field of view. So there, we have now our second field of view, second test subject. Again, note the difference in quality based on field of view. We have a very narrow field of view with this 4K camera versus a 180 degree field of view in this camera and a 360 degree panoramic view, so a much wider angle field of view. What this does is creates far fewer pixels on target. Starting with our 5 megapixel, again we're going to zoom in on our sign. Then we'll move to our 4K camera, zoom in on our sign. Our 180 degree panoramic camera, again 4K. Zooming in on our sign. And lastly, our 360 degree panoramic, our widest field of view, still 4K, zooming in on our sign. Again, notice the drop in detail based on field of view. Now a comparison of our fourth and final target. Man size, 170 feet away, 5 megapixel, 4K, 4K 180 degree panoramic, and lastly we'll zoom in on our 360 degree, partially obstructed by a sign here, but we can still see the top of that person barely. But again, the problem here is the limited number of pixels per square foot.
So even though we have all these comparison videos, there are a couple factors that we haven't taken into account here, and that is time of day and lighting.
Correct.
And also where this camera is being placed, right? So perhaps we have headlights coming at us if it's at night. You can see in some of these views you have some glare from the sun. So there are certain things at certain locations that can't be replicated. So in the end, ideally, our team comes out and does a site survey with you, sets up some cameras, makes sure that you're able to see the field of view and the targets that you're anticipating before you go and buy a system.
Okay. So does everybody get a better feeling? It's very difficult to explain this unless you do this. In this video, we used to have this video, it was a SIF and 2-SIF and 4-SIF and so on. What were they getting between the difference in 4-SIF or analog versus 4-SIF IP versus 720 and so on and so forth. So we've updated this a couple of times when we have these newer formats. One correction, Nick kept saying on there that those 12 megapixel cameras, the panoramic cameras, were 4K, they're 12 megapixel. They don't really meet that standard of 4K. Just a basic mistake, but just so that somebody doesn't go nuts and scream and yell about that, they're basically 12 megapixel format. Now, I'm sorry I forgot your name, but you asked a question about panoramic cameras earlier. What was the question that you asked?
The question that I was asking was the fact that the panoramic, is that a true 360 camera, or are we manipulating the software of the image through the software, and are we speaking about a fisheye image?
Okay. So it's a very good question, and effectively via electronics and via software, we are, I'll call it smoothing or correcting the video. So let's talk a little bit about that for a second. And this is one of those times where you wish you had a camera to kind of plug in and show you. But in the end, look at the back of that. Grab that panoramic data sheet again, that 7,000 panoramic data sheet. And it's got a couple of views on there, right? So on the front page of it, this is the one I'm talking about. On the front of it, it kind of gives the farm away. So 12 megapixels, if this is the imager is round, right? The 180 does this. It chops out that space, and that's what it is redoing. But keep in mind that the camera, if I mount the camera on a wall, and I'm top down here, okay, top down, if I mount the camera on the wall, it literally gives me, not quite 180, but it gives me everything in that field of view. We have a camera that's mounted on the corner of the office, right underneath of the soffit on one of the poles. And it, basically we can see the cars coming all the way up the road. So this is the 180. The 360 is top down. It is showing you this image. Okay? Has anybody ever heard the term warping or dewarping other than Star Wars? Okay. When the camera produces a picture, this is what is coming out of the camera. If you look at it from the raw feed, if you go to the web page of the camera, you can select the views. Now on this data sheet, back on the next page, page 2, this gives you a selection of some of the viewing possibilities that you can get out of the camera. This is how you can set the camera up to provide a picture if you're not using Bosch software. So you can get all those different possibilities as click choices in the web page. This is basically the camera doing the dewarping. If the software does the dewarping, if the VMS does the dewarping, then the dewarping gives you a different thing. Jeff, what do I get if I got a 360 camera and I want to put it in one of those windows? What's it look like? Best thing to say it looks like is everybody when they were a kid, you saw what a globe looks like, right? The Earth. And then when you flattened the picture out, what did you get? You got this kind of a goofy looking image like this, right? So when you look at it in its raw format, and remember on that one video we showed it was just going in a circle, continuous in a circle. All that is this thing going by and by and by in that image. So you can stretch it out to cover, a cameo in the software if you want to look like this. It's very odd looking because you don't know where it begins and it ends, right? A person will walk in. I had a customer who put it at a apex in an area of a building, and people would walk into the field of view and it would look really wicked because they would make like a real sharp turn and go walk away. And that's as they came to the camera and passed it, the camera, the optics and the rounding of the image, it looks like the person was walking towards it and then made this right turn and went away really fast. The software basically dewarps that and provides that image that you saw when we were showing you the clip of the museum, where things look straight. Straight lines are straight. People are upright. They're not bent. All those crazy things. That's called dewarping. You have to have a software package that's capable of doing that. Flattening or dewarping is the more technical name. So the answer to your question is it comes out of the camera looking like this. The software is what stands things up or makes things look the right way. Bosch does a really good job. I'll pat them on the back. Sometimes we're not the fastest to come to market, but if you took one of those cameras and put it on the table and took a lot of competitive cameras and put it on the table and you were looking at these straight lines on the ceiling, everybody else struggles to make the straight lines straight. They sort of bulge a little bit. Bosch does a really good job of straightening the lines out. Their software dewarping capabilities is pretty swift. Okay. The other thing is we're doing all this at 30 images a second. Some of the other product can't do 30 images a second, so we can do that at 30 images a second. Now, some of the other product can in disclosure, but this is what you get. Now, one thing you'll notice back in the video, the 180 camera appeared to have more resolution than the 360, right? When we were looking at the signs, the 180, again, this is stuff you find out by going out and playing with. That's what we do a lot. I think these people that drive by at our office, they think we're crazy from, 6 in the morning out there. At nighttime, we're out there doing stuff, and we're always doing different things. It's nice because there's a lot of things to view here. And then we do a lot of stuff in my backyard, which we'll have some footage of in a second. But people think we're crazy because we're always out there doing things. The only way for you to know this stuff, to the extent that some of the guys at the office or when you ask crazy questions, the only way for us to get an answer is to go try stuff. When Jeff calls up or Chris calls up or Jim calls up and says, what if, I don't know, but let me try. Okay, and that's where you get some of the, where we get some of that information. There's not going to be a stock answer. Some of this stuff, you can browse to the camera and see this kind of stuff, but all this other stuff, it's just really a trial and error kind of a thing. So this is what you get from a 360. This is what you get from a 180. And the reason the 180 gives you a better image is because you're not spreading. Remember, I'm looking top down, right? This is looking straight out. So the density of the pixels in the imager are far more dense when I'm doing this image versus this. This is looking at a lot more. It's spreading the pixels out around a lot bigger space. And we were only showing you the forward-facing area of that camera. The camera's still capturing all the stuff behind it. So it's spreading that pixel count and that pixel density out over a much larger area. Does everybody understand that piece? Did I answer your question about what comes out of the camera? Does anybody else have any questions about this resolution thing? The key to success here is the higher the number of pixels or TV lines of resolution, if you're really old like Steve or me, Steve, it was TVL, but nowadays it is pixel density or the number of pixels that the camera can record to do that. So 1080p is better than 720, 4K is better than 1080. Okay.
Question, it might be off topic, tiny bit, but you watch some of these sporting events, and if it's a night game, they'll have these cameras
zoom up to the moon, and you can actually see craters on the moon.
But remember, that's optical zoom. That's the lens changing, not you electronically zooming in like Nick was doing in the video.
Okay. It's totally different.
All right, so are we okay with resolution?